I wonder how much horsepower someone would have to sacrifice to stay at the same weight as the older two-stroke. Mercury does claim they have the lightest four-stroke engines.
This clip is brought to you by PartsView.com. Save money on all your boat engine parts when you use the link and discount codes in the description below.
Talking about the discussion of the weights on the different two-strokes and the four-strokes, they have come a long way on that over the past, since 2018, whenever Mercury came out with the V6, V8 package, which the entire deal. So from like 2002, 2001, 2002, all the way up until 2018, that range was the biggest range of people discussing and having the problem with a weight to horsepower ratio of the weight of a two-stroke and the weight of a four-stroke. The weight of a 3.3 liter 250 Yamaha compared to the weight of a 250 two-stroke, they were so far apart, it was a big problem. And so nobody wanted to go to the four-strokes because of the weight. All the people that had old engines and old boats couldn't support the weight of the four-strokes. But in the last 5 years or so, especially since 2018 when Mercury came out with their engines, the weight is not as much of a factor as it is in the higher range. Obviously in the lower range it is. So if you're looking at, depending on what you're looking at, like a 9.9 and a 20 horse or a 30 horse or a 6 horse, those smaller engines, depending on the brand and depending on what you have as far as your older two-stroke, some of those can swing, some of them are right in line and they're the identical almost, and then some of them are 30, 40 pounds apart, 50 pounds apart. So depending on the horsepower is going to be depending on the ratio. But I would say that, Mercury's, I want to say, most of their models are the lightest. That was their biggest deal. Like, that was the whole platform of going to the V8 was for, probably not the whole, but a big factor was the weight. They wanted the weight to come down, and they got the weight down. And a lot of the engines now, like if you go out to buy a brand new engine, if you can afford to buy a brand new engine right now, then the weight isn't as much of a factor as it was 10 years ago. 10 years ago, going from a two-stroke to a four-stroke, the weight was a big deal. Woody Stems, is there a similar benefit to using a two-stroke engine over a jet drive lower end unit? I think what you're trying to say is there a benefit to using a two-stroke over a four-stroke engine with a jet drive lower unit versus a lower unit? So kind of a two-stroke, four-stroke, and lower unit jet drive. Depending on the situation, yes. That's because let's take a 150, 175 horsepower. That situation is going to be, the two-stroke is going to be a V6, whereas the four-stroke is probably going to be a four-cylinder. So you're going to have more power out of that two-stroke six-cylinder engine than you are out of that four-stroke four-cylinder engine. And then also that is a factor because the jet drive versus a lower unit, a jet drive consumes a ton of power. So you lose a lot of power when you use water as propulsion. It's just kind of the way it goes. Thrusting water as your mode of propulsion, it consumes a lot of power compared to a solid propeller being spun in water. So, the thrust factors are way different, and the amount of power that you're going to consume spinning that propeller versus pushing water in order to move the boat forward is a lot. So I would say there's a big difference depending on what you're talking about with using a two-stroke and a jet drive and using a four-stroke and a jet drive. And I think the two-stroke and the jet drive, you're going to have a lot better performance depending on the horsepower rating and depending on the package, obviously. But I think that's what you're trying to get at. I'm not 100% sure. I think one of the things that you need to know is 100% the jet drives consume a lot more of your power coming out of your engine than it does for that lower unit to spin that propeller. Ozzy Kalines says, love the show, big fan. Thank you, Ozzy. Question, I have I'm having issues with running the twin F300 2010 after leaving the ramp and sometime going through the channel, motors turn off, and then I have to prime to get them restarted. I removed the VSTs and cleaned and replaced the fuel cooling passages and new cover and seal. The problem persists, but it does not do it all the time I go out. What are your thoughts? So for one, you're saying twin engines. So this is going to go for all engine packages in general. When it comes to troubleshooting, especially on stuff like this with a single engine or a twin engine, if you've got a twin engine boat and you have a problem with both engines at the same time, the problem is most likely not on your engine, because the likeliness of having an issue with the same part on two separate engines is so unlikely that it's very, very unlikely. So with this situation, I'd be looking at your fuel tank. Something going on with your fuel tank, the pickups, the fuel that you're running, your fuel selector valves that you might have, or maybe even the way it's ran through the water separators. I'd be looking at that before I'd be looking at those engines, because if you're running twin F300s, you leave the ramp and, sometimes going through the channel, motors turn off and you have to prime them up. So most likely it is something to do with the way that the fuel is being fed to the engines. And if you're losing your fuel prime just by idling out, then I'd be looking at the fuel tank and the fuel delivery system. I'm trying to think of if there's something that could be going on with the engines. As far as an F300, I'm trying to think. I removed the VSTs and cleaned and replaced the fuel cooling passages and new cover and seal. The problem persists. Yeah. I'm trying to think of a problem that could happen with you driving your boat to the ramp, pulling it down the ramp, putting it in the water, and somehow the engine's not getting the the lift pumps to turn on. Like maybe you've got fuel has gone up into out the vents and it's not turning your pumps on, but I don't think that that's a factor on the F300. Like if you had Verados, that's 100% a factor. We just made that video a few weeks ago about the Verado fuel system, the old system with the floats and the FSMs, and how they would fill up and trigger those vent canisters to not turn the pumps on. But as far as your VSTs on the F300s on a Yamaha, my guess is there's something this side on the boat side, not the engine side, because it's happening on both engines. So it's not going to be your VST. It's not going to be an individual component on your engines outside of something that is related to fuel delivery that's able to happen on both engines at the same time. Squidgy Sailor says, what's the smallest horsepower outboard that carries a left-handed outboard? So in a left-handed lower unit, counters, most brands, Yamaha's the 115 and Mercury's the 115. Trying to think off the top of my head whether Suzuki and Honda, I think most of them all do a counter in a 115. Some of them might stop at 150, but I want to say they all do 115 counters. Not 100%, but I'm pretty sure that's where it stops. But that's also kind of interesting and debatable, because you might not be able to buy, say, a 90 with a counter, but the 115 and the 90 is the same engine with just different computers. So technically, if you wanted a 90 left-handed rotation engine, you could put a left-handed lower unit on the 90 and make it a left-handed, theoretically. That's just thinking.
Now, if you enjoyed this clip, you can watch the full episode over here, or you can watch another one over here.